had a beautiful question in my Facebook group, which was, does procrastination have a purpose? I have been talking about overcoming procrastination with a compassionate approach, which means understanding that there is a natural response in the body that is likely going on, and it may even be related to more than just stress responses, but actual trauma responses. And so when that question came up, two questions came up actually as I was talking about this stuff. One was that, does procrastination have a purpose? And the other one was, is there a difference between quote unquote normal procrastination and procrastination that is based on trauma? And so I went and did a lot of research on this topic to try and get my thoughts around it. And I started talking about it. It actually turned out to be a little complex. So I thought I would come over here. I'm hoping that I haven't confused people over there. I thought maybe I'll come over here and talk out my ideas again and get a little more clarity. The primary thing that I think is really helpful to think about, however, is that if we look at our responses, our ways of being as natural, and this is the embodiment way, this is the understanding of how our nervous system interacts with the world, and that when we know that, when we know how that happens, there is this beautiful lens that comes on that enables us to say, everything that you're doing makes sense. Because often we can have this experience in ourselves that maybe, if we're talking about procrastination, which I am, and other responses too, when they're emerging, that we don't feel like, this doesn't make sense. Or we might judge ourselves. Why am I doing this again and again and again and again and again? Starting from that premise that it makes sense allows us to free stuff up. So how does procrastination relate to the stress response or to trauma? And what is the difference maybe? So there are a few nuances here in understanding the different ways that the system responds to stress and to trauma. Looking at it through the polyvagal theory, there are like multiple aspects. We're quite familiar these days with fight or flight response, or freeze has become more well known. But within freeze, it's actually more of a connected state in a good, well-balanced nervous system. A fight-flight sympathetic response, which is a mobilized energy. And I like to think about it about the quality of the sensations in the body and the way that you're feeling. Or an immobilized energy, which could look like freeze, which is more stiff, or it could look like collapse and floppiness. So when we're looking at procrastination, when we're experiencing procrastination and we're wanting to put some of these tools on to understand what's happening a little bit better for the purpose of, one, having more compassion for ourselves, and two, being able to move through it. Understanding, I'm just going to cover up the microphone because it felt like there was wind. Understanding first, yes, there's a purpose here. I'm trying to keep myself safe. Fundamentally, all of the stress responses and all of the trauma responses, and those two things are related. Think about the term, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, both words are in there, are designed to keep us safe. And if we're having a procrastination response, or we're procrastinating in response to a task, that task is triggering stress. Okay, and if we see ourselves responding in a fight or flight way, we could say this one might just be quote unquote normal stressed procrastination, where we are getting the task, there's the deadline, there's the pressure, and we're like, oh shit, here's a stress. What does my nervous system do? It says, I am going to either attack this thing full on, and this is the very workaholic approach to things. I'm going to attack this and I'm going to do 5 of these tasks all at once, and we fight. And then we end up not being very productive because we're scattered. Or we flight, and this will look for many people more like that urgent need to go wash the dishes or clean the house. These could be in the category of quote unquote normal. might not necessarily be related to trauma. My sense, and this is something I'm still playing with, so this is just my idea, my sense is that if we're going more into the final frontier of the nervous system, where it goes when fight and flight no longer has not worked, so thinking about the definition of trauma being an overload and an overwhelm of stress, so that the stress response in the initial stages hasn't worked, where do we go? We go to collapse, we go to freeze, we go to total shutdown. So if we notice that something like that is happening, where it's more an incredible lethargy in the body, or a dissociated, spacey, disconnected experience in the body, there isn't much energy going on. So it's not so much that anxious feeling where we're trying to deal with things, although that needs to be dealt with as well. And that may be a trauma response, but I believe that it's likely if we're going, especially if we're going here quickly, going straight to this response, that we might be looking at trauma. If we can't feel our body at all, or when we feel into our body it's really heavy, then we might be in the bottom end of what in the polyvagal theory Stephen Porges calls the dorsal aspect of the vagus nerve being very implicated in regulating our autonomic nervous system and our states and our sense of safety. So in this aspect, no safety, complete overload. Dealing with this is a little more complicated, and what I'm answering today is simply how do we know? So this is what I would say is maybe a way we could start to discern if we have a fight-flight response. So we get anxious in relation to the task and we start running around or running away or fighting. And then we do something that we know regulates us. We go for a run or do a bit of yoga or whatever it is, and we come back to the task and it's doable. Maybe this is a normal stressor, quote unquote normal stressor, or a normal experience of procrastination that's manageable, that we're able to attend to. If we regulate like that and things aren't moving so easily, or as I explained before, if we're in a collapse or freeze response, then we actually need to bring some of that energy of mobilization into the system to get out of that collapse and into movement and into action. But if we're finding that we're there and it's a little bit more difficult to shift, then we might be looking at what I call a trauma bubble. And the way, I'm going to give a potted version here, but I don't recommend doing this at home. I recommend doing this in the presence of a therapist or a trained somatic worker or somebody, unless you have a lot of experience guiding yourself through processes, which many people do, is to look at the association of the feeling with maybe an earlier time or memory that's similar. So I'll give you an example. This is one that I worked through recently for myself. I was moving house, and I remembered that in the past I would go into a collapse response, which makes moving very difficult when you've got no energy and lethargy, and there was some emotional distress for me associated with that as well, which was again a little bit of a sign that maybe there was some unresolved trauma energy in the system. So this time I was prepared, having done all this work for many, many years, and the move was coming up, and I started to notice that I was dissociating. I was like, I couldn't feel my body so well, and my thoughts were getting a bit cloudy and vague and spread out and disconnected. And so I was like, I think there's a trauma response going on here. I did some of the processes of connecting into my body and finding them and meeting them, offering them resonance, and then allowing, and in my case, memories did arise of being 10, 11 years old and my parents having been divorced, and I was on the bus traveling so often between those two houses with my little backpack and my guitar, feeling very overwhelmed by that situation. And I won't go into all the emotional details and stories, and but once I was able to work with that memory And so in some somatic practice, you don't need to work with the memory itself. You just work with the sensation. But I find it's really powerful when I do have some kind of, for myself and my clients, it can be really powerful when there is like a really clear, this makes sense, right? It has that, it's not exactly the same thing, but the feeling tone is the same. And my system thinks it's the same. My system has gotten stuck there in that time. And so it's thinking it's the same and it's bringing in the same response. So when I was able to, firstly, having that compassion again of understanding myself, shifted stuff really quickly. And then I was able to understand what to do, what tools I needed to apply, because I had nuanced patterns of what was going on, and I could understand the pattern of sensation in my body and in my nervous system. So that is how there's one way, everybody is different. I really want to put the caveat in here that everybody is different, and I don't have a recipe, a stock recipe of how to work through specific things, but we do know that we can start to map stuff and then try out certain tools. So does procrastination have a purpose? I believe so. Everything we do has a purpose. It's just a matter of understanding what that is. Generally speaking, through a nervous system lens, the purpose of our responses is always about taking us to, thanks Catherine, it's beautiful to see you here, is always taking us into, ask me any questions if you like, because I'm about to jump off. I came out to the park so I could talk and feel nice in nature and be regulated, but I'm going to have to pop back in. So if there's anything you want to know, please do pop a question in and I'll do my best to answer. So the purpose is safety. Once we understand that, we can then look at, if I am doing it in a normal kind of stress response and I can regulate easily, or if there is more of an immobilization, and that being a potential indicator of some kind of underlying unresolved trauma. And then if we're aware of that, how we then map that out using the patterns of what we can feel in our body and any associated experiences that might have gotten laid down, not necessarily in childhood, but frequently. Thank you so much for watching, Catherine. It was beautiful to have you here, and I hope whoever else watches this, that this is helpful. And I was telling my other group in my Facebook group, that it's very regulating. If you respond to me and you talk to me or leave a comment, it's very regulating for me to know, you're there, you're there and I can connect with you. So thank you for doing that, Catherine, and anyone else. If you do watch this, especially if you watch to this point, then I'm clearly going to know it had there was something in it for you that was interesting. So please do leave me a comment, and if you've got any questions, do the same, and I will come back and do another video and answer them, or answer them in the comments as best I can. Have a resilient and resonant day. Bye-bye.